The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy. So for this evening, for our final talk of the semester, we're very happy to have Professor Shu-mei Shih, who is with us from UCLA, where she has been teaching since finishing her PhD there. In comparative literature in 1992. She has a dual appointment in departments of Asian language and culture and in comparative literature. She has also spent recently much time in Hong Kong, where she is the endowed chair of Chinese at University of Hong Kong since 2013, and also a fellow at the Hong Kong Academy of the Humanities since 2014. She has a long list of impressive publications which all, more or less, contribute to really to defining a new field, the sort of emerging field of Sinophone studies, which we will hear something about tonight, I think, as well as making major interventions in sort of global humanities and theoretical conversations about the humanities. Some of her recent books include a co-edited book, The Creolization of Theory, in 2014, Visuality and Identity, Sinophone Articulations Across the Pacific in 2007, it's been quite influential, and the list goes on, but you would rather hear her than me. So please join me in welcoming Professor Shih.
Thank you, Professor Robin McNeil, for that wonderful introduction, and also to you and to Professor Brett DeBerry for the invitation. It's my first time to Cornell, and it's really a great pleasure to be here. So the piece I'm presenting today is drawn from the book I'm hoping to complete soon, Empires of the Sinophone. And it is an intervention into two fields, mainly postcolonial studies and Chinese studies. And as you can glean from the title of my talk today, right, comparative postcolonial theory, which is looking at postcolonial studies, and the question of Chinese empire is a critique of Chinese studies or engagement with Chinese studies. Comparative postcolonial theory points to the necessity of broadening the postcolonial critique from the privileged sites of Anglophone and Francophone studies, or Anglo-Franco focus, as some would say. And the question of Chinese empire is an invitation to consider a post-colonial critique based on Chinese empire in its intersection with other empires. That is, a proposal for an inter-imperial approach to post-colonial studies. The two interventions intersect in the field that I have been calling Sinophone studies, where further intersectionality was built in with ethnic studies and diaspora studies. From my since Sinophone communities are ethnic minority communities, oftentimes that are scattered around the world. From my talk today, you will be able to glean how postcolonial studies, Chinese studies, ethnic studies, and diaspora studies intersect within Sinophone studies. As well, I will draw from these fields and simultaneously putting pressure on them. As you know, I'm not a so-called expert of Southeast Asia, but I'll be talking a bit about Southeast Asia today. And Southeast Asia will be, in some ways, a point of departure for me today, but it will be seen as not only as a geographical category, but also as a political category and a theoretical category. Just as a footnote on Southeast Asia, I'm thinking about Southeast Asia here to include Taiwan and Hong Kong, which is completely unorthodox, for two reasons. I contend that maritime Southeast Asia, including Brunei, East Timor, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Singapore, must include Taiwan, if only because the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, the seafaring Austronesians, are genetically linked to the majority populations in Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia, and they have predominated in the history of maritime Southeast Asia. In imperial Chinese records, furthermore, the notion of Nanyang, the South Seas, which is generally equivalent to today's Southeast Asia, included Taiwan and Hong Kong. And we can look at the work of late 19th century Chinese scholar Zheng Guanying, who wrote a book called 盛世为言, advices during prosperous times for the definition of Nanyang or the South Seas, which included Taiwan and Hong Kong. And if you also look at New World Encyclopedia entry on Southeast Asia, Taiwan is also often considered part of Southeast Asia. So this is an unorthodox, cartography of Southeast Asia that I'm addressing today. Vis-a-vis that, I actually had a caveat, which I usually kind of announce at the beginning of my classes in Sinophone studies, which is that I tell my students, please check your nationalisms at the door, like you check your backpack when you go to the museum, right? So there's going to be enough affect produced by any kind of nationalism to go around any room. And so I'm asking you for your patience and to check your nationalism at the door for the following lecture. My hope is that a la Auerbach's notion of point of departure, this category will have the potential for what he calls centrifugal radiation for rethinking postcolonial theory. So for Auerbach, the idea of the point of departure is that when you're reading a novel, how do you find out how to enter into a novel and discuss it? And he presents this notion of point of departure, which could be an image, which could be a scene, which could be a character, and through which, through engaging with this one image or a scene, actually from there all the meaning generates, and you're able to encompass a discussion of the whole novel. And he calls it the kind of centrifugal radiation. And so perhaps, the Sinophone in Southeast Asia, especially in this context, could be, I'm hoping that it will serve as a kind of point of departure. In Marguerite Duhas's novel, The Lover, the namesake lover lived in an area of Saigon called Jolong. Jolong was a city built by the Hua, or Chinese Vietnamese people, in the 18th century, and later was incorporated into Saigon by the French colonial government. It is the largest Chinatown in the world by size, now a part of Ho Chi Minh City. This is where I visited in the spring of 2015, searching for local publications in the Sinitic script, or Chinese, in the bookstores along busy and dusty boulevards. And I found scores of story collections, poetry chapbooks, and literary journals as vibrant examples of contemporary Sinophone Vietnamese literature. If we were to study Duhas's China Lover from Sinophone perspectives, the assumed main narrative of the poor 15-year-old French girl who acquires a kind of sexual autonomy via her relationship with a rich Chinese man will have to be seriously interjected and intersected with the history of the Chinese Vietnamese people, bringing to life the largely silent lover in the novel. Not least because, of course, in the movie, the Chinese lover was played by the amazing Tony Leung from Hong Kong. He was Vietnamese Chinese, not Chinese. He was Chinese Vietnamese, sorry, not Chinese. His history was part of Vietnamese history. And if this were part of Chinese history, it would have to be a very inflected one. As an object of study, Sinophone Vietnam will be quite different from Francophone Vietnam in focus, even though they existed simultaneously. Or try the northern Vietnamese city of Hanoi, much farther north, where the French had its capital for most of the 20th century, hence much closer to China, where I also visited. Here, the distance between the Temple of Literature to the Opera House is only 2.5 kilometers. That takes approximately 30 minutes by foot. The Temple of Literature, which is a misnomer for what in actuality is the Confucius Temple cum Imperial Academy, and is modeled after similar Confucius temples in China, was built in the year 1070, where the Hanoi Opera House, modeled on the Opéra Palais Garnier in Paris, was erected in the early 20th century. These two landmarks belie the inter-imperial history of Vietnam, where Chinese colonialism from 111 BC almost continuously to 938 AD, and French colonialism, 1887 to 1945 or 1954, depending on how you do the chronology, occur consecutively, but their physical structures now coexist in time and space, not merely as remains, but as active and integrated part of life in Hanoi, as do tangible and intangible legacies of the American War, i.e. Vietnam War. This inter-imperial history, Chinese, French, American, has left expected linguistic and literary consequences. The use of the classical Sinitic script from China for 2 millennia, and the repurposed Sinitic characters called the Nom script for about 3 centuries, until the Latin alphabet was adopted as the sole form of orthography in the 20th century, while Francophone Vietnamese literary tradition continues to this day, and spatters of English are found in store signs and everyday speech. Within this history is situated the Sinophone community of Vietnam, of which Du Has's China Lover was a part, consisting of generations of settlers and immigrants from China who speak several distinct Sinitic languages, Cantonese, Hokkien, and Dokju, for instance, that are not the standard language of China, Mandarin. In this way, the modern Sinophone community as a minority community within and across empires in Vietnam activates a dynamic distinct from the usual colonizer-colonized dyad, and complicates colonial and post-colonial relationalities from binarism to multi-angulation. The confetti of empire is everywhere, but it is even as a metaphor of diverse kinds, shapes, colors, of varying densities and mixtures, and of different degrees of heaviness and light. Unlike any other part of the world, Southeast Asia, where the Sinophone has been a part for centuries, has seen the historical convergence of both European and Asian empires. The Chinese, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, British, French, Japanese, Americans, and Russians all came to Southeast Asia, where they contended, competed, imitated, and colluded with each other. Unlike the 19th century rush to carve up and colonize Africa, where Western European colonialism lasted for about 70 years, imperialism in Southeast Asia, with or without formal colonization, occurred over centuries. It is not an exaggeration to say that the region has been subjected to almost all major waves of imperialism from all around the world and over a long durée. Given this remarkable history, Southeast Asia offers unique sites for the study of imperialism and colonialism and their aftermaths. The extent, duration, and complexity of such a condition undoubtedly provides protean possibilities for theorizing the post-colonial. This, however, has not been the case. The prevailing model of post-colonial theory has privileged Western European empires of the 19th century with an almost complete neglect of Asian empires, especially those of China and Japan. It also appears that in post-colonial studies, oceanic empires are preferred over continental empires, such as that of China, perversely echoing Hegel's celebration of Europe's maritime principle and its love of flux and adventure that needed and justified outlets overseas. The Asiatic, according to Hegel, was limited by its landlocked status, and it lacks the outlet for life to step beyond itself, because to Asia, the sea is of no significance. Even among Western European colonies, there has also been a geographical favoritism that sanctioned the study of particular colonies over others. South Asia, the Caribbean, and Africa have received most emphasis, with some attention paid to such Commonwealth countries as New Zealand and Australia, which were, to my mind, mistakenly studied under the post-colonial framework, when in fact a more ethical framework would have been settler colonial studies in due recognition of the contested sovereignties by and colonial oppression of indigenous peoples. With rare exceptions, Southeast Asia, where both the British and the French established extensive colonies, was largely marginalized in Anglophone and Francophone post-colonial studies, and instead relegated to area studies under the name of Southeast Asian studies. If one studies Anglophone or Francophone Africa and the Caribbean, the work belongs to post-colonial studies. If one studies any part of Asia except South Asia, then the work belongs to area studies, even if this Asia was deeply touched by both the British and the French. This is why, to the postcolonial theorist Gayatri Spivak, the Asia beyond South Asia is ironically called the other Asias. As you know, that's the title of one of her books. To whom is the West Asia beyond South Asia the other? Such has been the particular temporal and spatial fixes of postcolonial theory as we know it in the disciplinary division of labor. Besides the privileging of specific former Western European colonies over others, say India over Burma and Malaya, even though, of course, Burma was part of British India, the Francophone Caribbean over Indochina, when in fact Indochina was much larger than all of the Francophone Caribbean islands combined. There has also been, as scholars of Latin America have pointed out, the privileging of Western European empires over Southern European empires from the early modern period. Latin Americanists have thus usefully made the distinction between what they call the first colonial modernity, Spanish and Portuguese, and the second modernity, Western European, and tried to correct the displacement of the former by the latter. For Southeast Asia, this first colonial modernity was also a crucially formative moment with the arrival of the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Portuguese. However, as Western European empires came and went, their timelines are messier than those of South America. The Dutch was a 19th century power in the Netherlands, East Indies, while the Spanish in the Philippines and the Portuguese in Macau and East Timor equally spanned the periods of First Modernity, Second Modernity, and beyond. As we know, Hong Kong and Macau were two of the last colonies given up by the Europeans in 1997 and 1998, respectively. The complex temporality of colonialism and the sheer diversity and multiplicity of imperial and colonial formations is understandably challenging to study. Yet the most crucial factor for the marginalization of this region of the world in postcolonial studies is, I believe, language. Across the British and French post-colonies in South Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, the languages of the colonial masters have, for the large part, remained de facto lingua franca, whether creolized or not, and to different degrees, and whether there continues to exist numerous other local languages, as in the case of South Asia. So the linguistic access is, so to speak, for the researchers from the West, apparently easier. If you limit your study of Anglophone South Asia, not the other languages. One can study global Anglophone literature without necessarily knowing any other languages but English. And the same goes for Francophone literature and French. Knowing English alone, however, will not give the researcher any reliable access to the ex-British colonies of Burma and Malaysia, where English no longer works, so to speak, and strong and vibrant local languages exist and are shared by the majority of the populations. For most of these countries, colonial languages have largely lost practical relevance by the 21st century, except, of course, the global now lingua franca of American English. Scholars who study these post-colonies, therefore, must do the hard work of learning additional languages other than English, French, Dutch, or Spanish, such as Thai, Bahasa Indonesia, Tagalog, Burmese, and what have you. At its root, the marginalization of Southeast Asia in postcolonial studies is due to the inertia as well as indifference of scholars who are not willing to take on the difficult task of learning languages other than the major Western European languages. Cornell, of course, is the storied place where Southeast Asian studies has been very prominent, and I will take Cornell as an exception. For area studies scholars who study Asia and spend long years learning Asian languages, it is not surprising that their linguistic investment can at times transform or transition into affective and even libidinal investments, which in turn partially condition the kind of scholarship produced, the methods deployed, and the perspectives preferred. I don't have time here to offer a critique of area studies. Suffice it to say that the issue of linguistic access lies at the core of the disjunctive relationship between postcolonial studies and area studies. There's a special issue being planned by Naoki Sakai and Gavin Walker, one of his former students, called The End of Area, and it's a critique of area studies at the present moment, and it's coming out hopefully soon, and I have an essay in it that critiques area studies from racialized perspectives, from Sinophone perspectives. Given the limits of Anglo-Franco focus, the desire to expand the postcolonial critique has been rather au courant these days, such as 1, the call for attending to the other Europe that has been marginalized, Eastern Europe and the rest, negotiating post-socialism with post-colonialism, minor and major empires, and countries without colonies, etc. 2, the call to attend to the entire post-Soviet sphere of 28 countries, including the former Soviet republics. 3, the call, particularly important for my purpose, to consider the Americas most seriously, especially the Spanish Empire. Most crucially for my purpose here, I want to highlight the work of Brené Mendoza, who hasn't published a lot in English, but some of her essays in Spanish, and her reminder that the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish was crucial to the configuration of capitalism in Europe. And without the rise and expansion of European capitalism, there would not have been the colonization of Asia. In short, the colonization of Asia was mediated by colonization of the Americas. And this is the relational history that undergirds my intervention into post-colonial critique. As is well known, the Spanish silver dollar, minted from silver from the Americas and transported by Manila galleons, also known as China ships for mainly carrying Chinese goods to Spain, was the first global currency accepted by China for about 200 years, between the 17th and 19th centuries. This is a well-known example of how Europe, the Americas, Southeast Asia, and China have been connected in the global economic relations, which were colonial relations involving Spanish America as well as the Spanish Philippines. The discovery of silver in the Americas, of course, also accentuated the growth of the African slave trade. Colonialism is produced out of global relations, period. Robert Young has, in this regard, usefully called for a tricontinental orientation, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, in postcolonial studies in his book, Postcolonialism and Historical Introduction. Young's main focus, however, remains the European empires of the British and the French, again centering his critique against the same exceptionalized West, in this case, including the United States. Southeast Asia received very brief treatments in the book, all in less than a few pages, in terms of the obligatory reference to the Bandung Conference of 1955, and of course, also obligatory reference to the Vietnam War. When the account of history is zoomed out, to this tricontinental or tetracontinental or world and global level, Southeast Asian countries are usually even more readily relegated to insignificance. Sinophone studies, defined as a study of synergic language communities and cultures around the world, and on the margins of China and Chineseness. So this definition has been very much engaged with, contested with, and so forth. And I intentionally leave the phrasing on the margins of China and Chineseness ambiguous in order to leave room for greater flexibility in talking about Sinophone framework. What's important to me is not what Sinophone is, but what Sinophone does, right? So if we're coining new concepts, the concepts have to work. They have to do the work. And it's not for no reason we need new concepts. With new concepts come new ways of looking at the world, hopefully. So Sinophone studies has been one effort that not only aims to expand the postcolonial critique, but to go beyond it, as the Sinophone is imbricated in divergent, multiple, and layered colonial conditions that exceed the postcolonial framework and is also inherently inter-imperial. In Southeast Asia, the Sinophone, with the exception of Singapore, has been a minoritarian community during the colonial period and after. And this is the history of the China lover in Geelong, in Margaret Duas's novel, The Lover. Before the European arrival, traders and immigrants from China started arriving in Southeast Asia since at least the 13th century, and by 1700 were unrivaled as the preeminent commercial minority everywhere in Southeast Asia. Historical records show that they were originally very welcome for their wealth, skills, and international connections, and there was no distinct notion that these people were Chinese in any specific way. The early settlers became the so-called Straits Chinese. They were a large group of mixed people, such as Babas and Nonias, the locally born Peranakans who spoke their distinctive languages then mixed different Sinitic languages such as Hokkien and Cantonese with Malay. In other words, it was not the European colonizers who have created the condition of racial and cultural mixing, as has been theorized in postcolonial studies. Rather, they were already mixed before the European arrival. Mixing, of course, is one of the most important, if not the most popular concepts in postcolonial theory, which correlates in three imperial languages: the French métissage, the English hybridity, and the Spanish mestizaje. In all these instances, the emphasis is on the mixing of Europeans and the native, not the mixing that had already been going on for centuries on the ground among more than two groups of non-European people. And Stoller, when discussing the issue of métissage in Indochina, for instance, does not even make one mention of the Hua people. In a book-length study on racial relations of desire in colonial Southeast Asia, her emphasis is again on Europeanness and whiteness. In one sense, the Chinese Southeast Asians were twice denied their hybridities. They were denied the chance to be métis, mestizos, mestizas, babas, noñas, when in fact they already had been these before the European arrival. In the Philippines, for instance, the term mestizo, mestiza actually is exclusively used to designate those Filipinos with some Chinese ancestry. So mestizo is actually Chinese in the Philippines. Before Benedict Anderson in this regard argues that it was actually the arrival of Europeans that turned these people into Chinese. I think this argument is made by others as well, but as a non-Southeast Asian specialist, so much of our knowledge of Southeast Asia or inspiration is gained from reading Ben Anderson, who was one of your colleagues. I know that's a complicated issue within Southeast Asian studies, how that really works. European colonizers instituted various policies of racial divide, insisting that even those who had been there for generations and spoke no Sinitic language of any kind were Chinese. The Dutch, for instance, had a strict policy of governance of the Indies Chinese with sumptuary codes, a quote from Ben Anderson, sumptuary codes, residential sequestrations, imposed inheritance regulations, while creating collaborationist business elites. And in these, they imitated British practices. Fearing that their Chinese minorities would collude with China or gain too much dominance in their colonies, the colonial powers exercised hysterical control in many cases, leading to massacres of the Chinese minorities as early as the 16th century, most notably in Manila in 1586, 1603, 1639, 1662, and 1686, and in Batavia, today's Jakarta, in 1740, while Brunei, Cambodia, Vietnam, Siam, and Malaya also saw many incidents of racial killings of Chinese minorities during the colonial period. By 1920, a specific discourse of a Chinese imperialism emerged in the Dutch East Indies, expressing the fear that the massive migration of Chinese would bring Chinese imperialist thinking with them, and those Indies Chinese already there would support such expansionism. They consider such a scenario to be, quote, fateful for the Dutch future, which is a quote from a colonial government document regarding this issue. In the postcolonial period, Southeast Asia's anti-Sinicism, so this is a new term coined by scholars who study this, instead of Semitism, anti-Sinicism, meaning the racism against the Chinese minorities in Southeast Asia. Anti-Sinicism against the Chinese minorities in their midst continued unabated until as late as 1998, with numerous incidents of racial killings in Indonesia, including the death of about 300,000 in the 1965 Communist Purge. So imagine, right, because China was a communist country, if you're Chinese in Southeast Asia, you can be easily considered, right? You can make that conflation very easily. And in that name, you can be persecuted. And this happened to a lot of Chinese minorities across Southeast Asia, of course, with the exception of Cambodia and Vietnam, because they have communist, sympathies and regimes. But let's say Malaya especially, because the Malayan Communist Party, the membership of the Malayan Communist Party established in 1930 was half Chinese Malaysians and half Malays. And after the colonizers, after the British left, Malayan Communist Party was basically persecuted and in very bloody fashion, and many of them became guerrilla fighters in the rainforests of the Borneo and are hiding in northern parts of Malaysia, and they didn't know that things have changed in Malaysia. And there are interesting narratives about these people who emerged in the 1990s. They've been hiding from the communist purge, and these are Chinese Malaysians who've been hiding from the communist purge for decades. So the 1965 Communist Purge, the May 1969 racial program in Jakarta, and Vietnam's expulsion of the Hoa in the hundreds of thousands in 1978-79, to name just a few. An argument can be made that post-colonial Southeast Asian states' anti-Semitism is a legacy of colonial policies that scapegoated the Chinese minorities in the face of fear and anxiety due to an imagined or real Chinese imperialism. So what about this Chinese imperialism in Southeast Asia? Is this imagined or is it real? This is the second story I'm trying to tell in the beginning of my talk with regards Hanoi, Chinese Empire, and its cultural consequences in Vietnam. These consequences are so pervasive that a recent book by scholar at Vanderbilt, Ben Tran, calls modern Vietnam, quote unquote, post-Mandarin Vietnam. So why would you call modern Vietnam a post-Mandarin Vietnam, right? Basically, it's post-Chinese Vietnam. Indeed, European fears had their historical precedents. Prior to the arrival of the Europeans during the early and relatively open stage, the Chinese had actually created ruling dynasties in Southeast Asia, notably in Ayutthaya, Brunei, Malacca, and Demak. They also established autonomous Chinese polities at Ha Tien in Vietnam, in Vietnam, Cambodia, borderland, and in the goldfields of Western Borneo. And powerful Thonburi and Bangkok dynasties in Siam were themselves half Chinese. Among them, the independent republic in Western Borneo, the Lanfang Republic, Lanfang 共和国, for instance, lasted over 100 years, 1777 to 1884. And it's one of the earliest republics in the world. Scholars have argued that these can variously be considered settler dynasties, settler colonies, or tributary states to China. The relations between China and Southeast Asia in the post-colonial period have been nothing but turbulent, right, after the Europeans have left, even if when we figure in the Bandung Conference and the so-called non-aligned countries and countries of color or people of color solidarities. The Chinese economic support, as is known, was crucial in sustaining the Pol Pot regime. China fought a border war with Vietnam in 1979 and continues to have military skirmishes along the border, including border skirmishes with Myanmar, which continues at this moment. There are also the famous conflicts that everybody reads in the news about in the South China Sea involving the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, but in effect, China has territorial disputes now with almost all of its neighbors. Okay, so the question of Chinese empire. If there's relatively no doubt that Britain and France were empires that behaved imperialistically, so empires that behave imperialistically are empires. You see the tautology here. The question of Chinese empire, persistently marginalized in post-colonial studies, has been beset by ambiguity, if not controversy. The two words China and empire have both been to different degrees unstable and problematic, and particularly so when they're placed together into the compound term Chinese empire. And we also, of course, we all understand the pressures that one must feel when calling China an empire today. China, of course, is a self-signifier as not only that what constitutes China geographically has changed dramatically over time, but also that the name China itself is a construction with a contested historical and textual genealogy, each instance of construction implicating the questions of who defines it, who claims it, and doing so on what grounds. Even if put in the most general terms, there are both spatial and temporal variations to this construction. Spatially, what we call China has been a changing geographical entity with dramatically different territorial boundaries over time, and at its smallest, it was perhaps 1/10 of today's China. What territorial China has been over history is therefore not a given, but a process. As a Chinese scholar living in Shanghai, Ge Zhaoguang claims, this is not his own original claim, although he's known for this claim. So recent studies have shown that actually he's gotten this claim from the German scholar Rolf Trautzettel. I don't know how to pronounce their name. Trauzzettel, Trautzettel. That the consciousness of China, 中国, as a national identity or a proto-national identity really only began as early as in the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279. Temporally, what we call China may not even be the correct nomenclature for certain periods of history over the changing geographical area, especially when it comes to those historical periods prior to the Sui Dynasty, 581-618, when the territory about the size of 1/4 of today's China was unified under ethnic Han rule, as well as periods of non-Han rule. So especially in regards to periods of non-Han rule, right? So the so-called Han Chinese were not the rulers of these places. Then does that mean that it's a Chinese place, right? These include such times of intense fragmentation as the Six Dynasties and those periods of non-Han rule such as the Mongol Empire, aka Yuan Dynasty. So if you're Chinese, you say Yuan Dynasty. If you're not Chinese, you say Mongol Empire. And the Manchu Empire, right? AKA Qing Dynasty. Similarly, if you're Chinese, it's Qing Dynasty. If you're not Chinese, Han Chinese, then it's Manchu Empire, right? For our purposes here, the crucial question is whether we can consider today's China as an empire, and this question must be related to the other question of whether Yuan Dynasty, Mongol Empire, and Manchu Empire are Chinese or not. But because Manchu Empire immediately precedes the Han rule that began in 1912 with the Republic of China, which then later, of course, was inherited by PRC, today's China. And so the crucial question is, immediately relevant question is to ask the question, is the Manchu Empire Chinese? This question was the topic of an intense debate in the field of Chinese studies in the United States between the proponents of the Sinicization thesis and the scholars of the so-called New Qing history. This question is not merely who claim otherwise, the New Qing history who can't claim otherwise. This question is not merely an academic one, however. It has bearings on whether contemporary China is an empire or not, on the one hand, and the strategic answers to the question have been deployed by both the Chinese state and its intellectual apologists for specific purposes, amounting practically to how the state defines sovereignty as well as national security, on the other. Briefly, the Sinicization thesis is basically a unidirectional assimilationist thesis, as summarized by Crossley, Sue, and Sutton. It assumes that the inherent charisma of Chinese culture as the single civilizing force emanating from the Chinese imperial center has assimilated all alien cultures and peoples throughout history, including the periods of alien rule. For this narrative, not only that the history of military conquests are minimized and displaced, but also that local societies and indigenous populations are detached from and denied their participation as well as credit in the state-making process. According to this thesis then, the Sinicization thesis, everyone ineluctably becomes Chinese, thanks to the superior civilization that is Chinese. How many of us have become Chinese because you study China, right? And that's of course Du Weiming's cultural China model. New Qing historians disagree. First and foremost, they argue for the Manchu-ness of the Qing Empire. Evidence after evidence shows how the Manchus deliberately maintained their unique ethnicity, language, and culture through, for instance, the ethnicity-specific and hereditary eight-banner system, which began as military divisions but ended up being mainly identity markers for the Manchus, who through this system were granted land and income for no other reason than their ethnicity. The Chinese land conquered by the Manchus was only the 17 provinces of the Ming dynasty, and to this were added the vast lands of Xinjiang. Xinjiang, right, literal means new dominion. So unless it is new, why would it be called new dominion, right? Xinjiang, Tibet, and Mongolia, which along with Manchuria constituted about 5/8 of the entire empire. Territorially, then the so-called China proper was less than half of the empire. So if we answer positively to the question, is Manchu Empire Chinese, meaning yes, Manchu Empire is Chinese, then the fact that the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China have inherited all the territories conquered by the Manchus, except Outer Mongolia, unequivocally shows that contemporary China has inherited the empire, right, in a historical succession. Right? If we say Manchu Empire was Chinese, then contemporary China is inherited the empire. Just a fact. So if we say no, that PRC that the Manchu Empire was not Chinese, then the PRC is a success story of Chinese nationalism, Han Chinese nationalism, overcoming an alien regime, right, the Manchus, and restoring its sovereignty from a victimized state, all the more successful for claiming to have driven out Western imperialists too. In fact, contemporary Chinese nationalism has often utilized both positions, even though they're apparently contradictory with each other. Namely, Manchu Empire is Chinese, hence Manchu territory is Chinese. Right? Otherwise, how do you say those territories are Chinese? Unless you say Manchu Empire is Chinese. Yes? Okay, see the logic? And simultaneously, the Manchu Empire is not Chinese, hence the Chinese were not imperialists, right? They were and they're not imperialists because Manchu Empire was not Chinese. Does that make sense? Okay, so you see the two contradictory statements. The effective use of both positions allows contemporary China to claim inheritance and legitimacy without taking responsibility. This is the China that is comprehended within China as a natural consequence of 5 millennia of continuous history and political unity, and the China as it is attributed as such and sanctioned by the international community. By this logic, if the Mongol Empire was also Chinese, remember Mongol Empire, reached Persia, right? So if Mongol Empire was also Chinese, shouldn't Chinese sovereignty today extend to today's Iran? Or was China simply a part of the Mongol Empire? Right? So was Mongol Empire Chinese? Was Mongol Empire not Chinese? Depending on which position is taken, we can draw dramatically different political implications. Similarly, the term empire has been put into question in terms of whether empire and imperialism belong to the same semantic category, and whether then they imply each other or not. If acting imperialistically is what makes one an empire, then the argument goes, imperialism is a distinctly Western behavior that China has not engaged in, hence China is not an empire, right? From within China, either empire, 帝国, is categorically denied to have anything to do with contemporary China or replaced by other terminologies, such as the revived notion of the Chinese world order, known as all under heaven, 天下 discourse, the arrival of the new age of power, 盛世, or the pursuit and fulfillment of the Chinese dream, 中国梦. In an attempt to account for the supranational, multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multilingual entity that is today's China that exceeds the modern notion of the nation-state, and while insisting on Westphalian notion of sovereignty and refusing the term empire, Chinese intellectuals have had to offer various new concepts to describe the Chinese state form, calling it, for instance, a multi-systemic state, right? So it's one state with many systems. A multi-state system, China is a system with many states. Or a civilizational state, right? So instead of a civilizational empire, it has a state form, and so it's a civilizational state, where the logic of belonging of the vast frontier, especially the Greater Tibet and Xinjiang, to China, is supposedly totally unique to China. Here is a new version of Chinese exceptionalism, which is crucially calibrated with what Ray Chow has called in 1998 the logic of the wound. The logic of the wound makes so I've been wounded by Western empires, right? So I am justified in expressing my 호상티멍, my anguish, my anger, in however form it takes, in whatever form it takes. That's sort of the logic of the wound. The logic of the wound makes a fetish of Chinese victimhood at the hands of Western imperialism since the Opium Wars to such an extent that China can only be the object of empire and not the subject of empire. This essentially is the Chinese postcolonial position. So in the 90s and 2000s, within China, within PRC, there was an emergence of Chinese postcolonial critique. Which is basically anti-Western imperialist critique. So Han Chinese intellectuals claim that they were the victims of Western imperialism, and that's the Chinese, and so China was postcolonial. The euphemization of Chinese power and fetishization of Chinese victimhood, both are in fact discourses of Chinese exceptionalism, vouchsafed a condition in which China is now and forever beyond reproach, leading to the injunction that in so many forms and practices declares China cannot be criticized. This injunction might have begun as a psychological need based on past victimhood, but given China's economic and political power with an ever-expanding ability to pressure and to censor, is no longer merely psychological. This is the history of the present connected with the long history of the past. In the longer durée of history, the 100-year history of China being the object of empire from mid-19th to mid-20th century is a short and finite duration, now given a proper name as 100 Years of Shame, 百年国耻. It's a proper term to describe this 100 years of shame. The question we need to ask is this: for how much longer is the present and the future? For how much longer in the present and the future should the logic of the wound govern Chinese relations with the rest of the world? What are the responsibilities of Chinese studies scholars, or any scholar, in such a present? Crucially also, what are the responsibilities of postcolonial critique when Chinese intellectuals have already hijacked this critique in their criticism of Western imperialism and claimed a Chinese postcoloniality? Finally, how would a globally oriented postcolonial critique that takes Southeast Asia and Chinese empire seriously look like? I hope I have gestured towards it in my talk today in however a small way. Thank you for being such a great audience. Great, thank you.